The rain lashed against the window beside me as the plane touched down with a jolt that rattled my teeth. Outside, the sky was a dark bruise, swollen with clouds. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the tarmac for a split second before plunging it back into shadow. The usual relief I felt upon landing was muted. Something about this wasn't right. We taxied for what felt like forever, the engines whining as the plane crept through the storm. The captain's voice over the intercom had been strained when he mentioned the diversion, some problem at our intended airport. We were landing at a smaller airfield, one with a terminal that hadn't seen regular use in years. That part stood out, a place they kept for emergencies. The terminal loomed ahead, its silhouette blocky and unwelcoming. The jet bridge creaked as it locked into place and the cabin crew busied themselves, opening the door and gesturing us to disembark. I stepped out onto the metal ramp, my carry-on bag bumping against my leg, and entered the terminal. The air inside was stale, the faint smell of mildew creeping in beneath the stronger tang of industrial cleaner. The place was sparse, the kind of sterile design you'd expect from a building that hadn't been touched in decades. Rows of cracked plastic chairs lined the walls, and a faded sign above the entrance read, "Gate 66 inches" in peeling black letters. There were no airline staff to greet us, no announcements, no explanation. Just the faint flicker of fluorescent lights above and the occasional rattle of the storm outside. A handful of passengers muttered as they settled into seats, but most of us just stood around, expecting someone to arrive any moment. Minutes turned into an hour. The rain drummed against the roof in a constant, uneven rhythm. The other passengers sprawled across the chairs or leaned against the walls, staring at their phones or out of the windows into the dark. I checked my watch again. Nearly 2 hours had passed since we'd landed, and still no one had come. The lights flickered again, longer this time. A buzzing sound came from somewhere above, and I glanced up to see one of the fixtures swaying slightly. A few of the passengers murmured, but no one moved. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't check for updates. The plane we'd arrived on was still visible through the rain-spattered glass, sitting there like a hulking shadow. Another hour slipped by, and the atmosphere in the terminal began to shift. A man in a suit stood and approached the desk near the gate, knocking on it as though that would summon someone. When nothing happened, he shrugged and walked back to his seat. A woman across from me wrapped her coat tightly around herself, her eyes darting toward the exits. Then someone disappeared. I didn't notice at first. It was the sound, a clatter that made me turn my head sharply. A suitcase had toppled over near the far wall, its owner nowhere in sight. I looked around, expecting to see them returning from the toilets or standing at the window, but they weren't there. It was odd, but I didn't think much of it until another passenger vanished. This time I saw the aftermath. An empty seat, a half-finished drink on the floor, and no sign of the man who'd been sitting there moments earlier. I scanned the room, but no one else seemed to have noticed. Or maybe they had and were just pretending not to. The flickering lights became more frequent, the gaps between each flash longer. By then, the terminal was quieter. There were fewer people now, though I hadn't seen anyone leave. My chest tightened as I counted. 15, maybe 20 of us remained. The others, where had they gone? The lights buzzed again and the sound grated against my nerves. The air felt colder and I rubbed my arms through my jacket, trying to stay calm. I kept glancing toward the doors leading back to the plane, but they were locked. The woman with the coat had moved closer to the exit, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the glass. Another passenger disappeared. This one was sitting only a few seats away. There was no sound, no movement, just an empty spot where she had been. Her bag sat slumped on the floor, straps dangling. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved closer to the center of the room. The remaining passengers were scattered now, their faces pale, their movements jerky. No one looked directly at anyone else. No one spoke. It was as though we all knew something was happening, but were too afraid to acknowledge it. The lights went out completely. For several seconds, the only sound was the pounding rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Then the lights came back on, weaker than before. Fewer of us were left. I didn't know how many had gone, but the terminal felt emptier, the silence pressing against my ears. I clutched my bag tightly, my knuckles aching. Something about the shadows beneath the chairs, the way they seemed to stretch longer than they should, made my skin crawl. The buzzing of the lights was constant now, a faint thrum that seemed to echo in my skull. I didn't see the man disappear. I only realized he was gone when I noticed his coat still draped over the chair beside him. My pulse hammered in my ears. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare look away from the center of the room. My eyes darted from the doors to the empty seats to the darkened corners. The air felt thinner. My breaths came shallow and fast. When the lights flickered again, I heard a faint scuffling sound. It was coming from the far end of the room near the toilets. When the light steadied, there was nothing there. But the door to the toilets was swinging gently as though someone had passed through it. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs were locked in place, my bag clutched against my chest like a shield. The woman near the exit was gone now, her coat crumpled on the floor where she'd been standing. The lights dimmed once more, and the terminal seemed larger somehow, the corners stretching into darkness. There were fewer of us now, just 3, maybe 4. I couldn't tell anymore. The rows of chairs seemed to stretch endlessly, and the sound of the rain outside had faded, replaced by the faint buzz of the failing lights. When the darkness returned, I braced myself. The flight was supposed to be an easy one, a long haul but straightforward. I'd booked it for the overnight hours, hoping to sleep through most of it. The airline had a reputation for efficiency, and I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. After takeoff, I had dinner from the tray they handed out, a bland chicken and rice with a roll that could have doubled as a paperweight. It wasn't great, but it filled the time. The cabin lights dimmed after the meal service, a signal for everyone to settle down. I flipped through the in-flight entertainment and eventually let the steady sound of the engines lull me to sleep. When I woke, it was pitch dark. The cabin lights, which normally stayed dimly lit during the flight, were barely glowing. It felt like waking in the middle of a power cut. I rubbed my eyes, disoriented. The plane felt quiet. Too quiet. No murmurs of conversation, no faint sounds of the crew moving about. I glanced to my left and right. Both seats next to me were occupied by passengers with their heads tilted back, mouths slightly open, asleep. Across the aisle, the same. Head slumped, limbs slack. Everyone was still. I looked at my watch, but the face was blank. I tapped it, but it didn't respond. A dead battery, or maybe I hadn't charged it properly. I reached for the screen on the back of the seat in front of me. It stayed black when I touched it. No response there either. The engines were still droning on, steady and strong. At least the plane was still flying. I craned my neck, trying to see further down the cabin. Rows of passengers, motionless, and no sign of any crew. The air felt stale, the sort of atmosphere you'd expect when a room's been sealed for too long. I pressed the call button above my seat, the tiny orange light clicking on. I waited, but no one came. I pressed it again, harder this time, as though that would make a difference. I decided to stand. The aisle stretched ahead of me like a tunnel, dark except for the faint overhead lights, glowing more like distant stars than proper illumination. The seats were all occupied, everyone frozen in sleep. No one stirred as I walked past them. The galley area near the middle of the plane was empty. No carts, no crew. I pushed open the curtain to the area where the flight attendants usually gathered. The space was as bare as the rest of the plane. Cups stacked neatly on shelves, a few unopened boxes of snacks. It was as though they'd all just stepped away for a moment, leaving everything perfectly in place. I made my way to the front of the plane. The cockpit door loomed, its keypad glowing faintly in the dim light. I knocked once, then again. I stood there for what felt like ages, listening for anything on the other side. Nothing, no voices, no movement, not even a crackle from the intercom. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the cold metal. The engines hummed on, steady as ever. I tried the handle, though I knew it wouldn't budge. It didn't, locked tight. Heading back down the aisle, I tried to focus. The plane was still flying, still moving forward, but something about the passage of time felt stretched. It should have been morning by now. I'd glanced at the time zone chart before boarding. The sun should have been peeking through the windows. Instead, the view outside was nothing but blackness, no stars, no city lights below, just darkness as far as I could see. A man stirred in his seat as I passed. I paused, hopeful, but he didn't wake. His head shifted slightly before settling back. The others remained still. It was like walking through a wax museum, their faces slack and expressionless. I reached my seat again and sat heavily, trying to think. My stomach growled. I realized I was starving. How long had it been since dinner? Hours? A day? There was no way to tell. I opened the window shade beside me and peered out. The void outside was the same, endless and impenetrable. Time passed, or it didn't. The engines droned on, the lights flickered faintly again, so briefly I almost missed it. When I glanced around, nothing had changed. The passengers were still slumped, the crew still absent. I tried standing again. My legs were stiff and I stumbled slightly. This time I moved toward the rear of the plane. The toilets were unoccupied, their doors ajar. The rear galley was as empty as the front, and just as unnervingly tidy. I opened one of the cupboards and found stacks of neatly arranged meal trays. Everything was in its place, untouched. As I turned back toward the aisle, I froze. One of the seats near the back was empty. I was sure it had been occupied earlier. I approached cautiously, my hands gripping the seatbacks for balance. There was nothing unusual about it, just an empty seat with the seatbelt still fastened. The tray table stowed neatly away. I moved back toward my seat, trying not to let my mind spiral. The engines continued, the only constant in the eerie stillness. I sat down again and glanced outside once more. The view hadn't changed, though I swore the blackness seemed deeper somehow. I shut the shade and pressed my head back against the seat. The flight was running smoothly, just like any other. It was a long haul, the kind where the hours passed by in a blur of films, food, and dozing off. I don't know what time it was when it happened, but it was around the point where you start to lose track of time. I was reading a magazine when I heard it, the sound of the cabin pressure warning, that sharp, high-pitched whine that cuts through the usual hum of the plane, followed by the sudden drop of the seatbelt signs. I looked up just as the oxygen masks dropped from the compartments above. The golden bags swayed for a moment, almost floating, before settling down to hang in front of each seat. I'd flown enough to know the drill. Pull the mask down, slip it over your nose and mouth, breathe normally. Simple. The crew was moving down the aisles, helping those who were struggling with the masks, making sure everyone was properly secured. I followed their instructions, adjusting the mask over my face, the rubbery smell of it making me feel a bit lightheaded as I breathed in the sterile air. The plane kept its steady course, and the turbulence wasn't bad, just enough to remind you were high up. Nothing that would make you panic. But then I heard the woman. It was hard to pinpoint where she was at first. Her voice was shrill, high-pitched, as if it was coming from the back of the cabin. She was screaming about something. At first I thought she was just panicking like some people do during these situations. But then I realized she wasn't panicking about the drop in pressure. She was screaming about the masks. She kept shouting that the masks weren't right, that they weren't giving her air. I looked around, unsure whether to try and help or just stay in my seat. The stewardess was already on her way down the aisle, moving quickly, trying to calm the woman. The woman's seat was just a few rows ahead of me, and I could see her now, thrashing against the straps of her seatbelt, her hands pulling at the mask over her face like she was trying to rip it off. But it didn't seem like she was trying to get air. She kept yelling that the mask was pumping something else into her lungs, something not right. Her face was red, her eyes wide, but she wasn't acting like someone who couldn't breathe. She was thrashing and kicking, still screaming about the air, but there was something in her voice that didn't sound like fear. It sounded like hysteria, like she had already lost control of what was going on in her head. The stewardess was speaking to her now, but I couldn't hear the words. The woman wasn't listening. She yanked at the mask again, still screaming, still struggling. At that point, I wasn't sure whether it was the panic that had made her lose it, or if there was something genuinely wrong with the mask. The air around me felt colder, and I could see my breath in front of my face as I exhaled. It was like I could taste the chill in the air now. The pressure was making my ears pop, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I wasn't dizzy or faint, and the mask was still giving me air. I kept breathing, but something about the woman's voice, her shrill, desperate screams, made me feel uneasy. The stewardess was still trying to calm her down. I could see her from where I was sitting, her hand on the woman's arm, speaking softly, but the woman wasn't responding. She was still fighting, still screaming. I could see her mouth moving behind the mask, but the words didn't make sense. She seemed to be getting louder with every passing second, like she was trying to say something that no one could hear. And then it happened. The woman's voice faltered, her body went rigid, and she stopped thrashing. She just froze, her hands hanging limply in her lap, her mask still firmly over her face. The stewardess stepped back, looking down at her in confusion, and I could see a brief flicker of fear cross her face. The woman didn't move for a long time. It wasn't like she was unconscious. Her chest was still rising and falling, her breathing steady, but she wasn't making a sound. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on something in front of her, staring at nothing. The air felt still in the cabin now, except for the low hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of the intercom overhead. The stewardess kept glancing at the woman, but no one was saying anything. It was like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something that none of us could explain. The woman had stopped screaming, but something was still off. No one could figure out why she'd reacted like that, why she had suddenly gone quiet after all the noise. I looked down at my own mask, still firmly in place, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I could feel my heart rate picking up, the tension in my chest. I reached for the button to call the stewardess, but before I could press it, the lights flickered. It was so brief I almost missed it, like someone had switched them off for a second and then back on. The cabin went silent, and the mask I was wearing suddenly felt uncomfortable, like it was pressing too tightly against my face. I could still breathe, but I could feel something subtle but unnerving, a kind of pressure, like the air wasn't flowing the way it was supposed to. The woman remained frozen in her seat, her eyes still staring ahead, her mask still over her face. The other passengers hadn't moved. They were all still in their seats, some with their masks on, some without, but no one was doing anything. The stewardess came back to check on the woman. She reached out a hand, but stopped just short of touching her, as if she wasn't sure what to do. A look of confusion passed over her face, and I saw her glance up at the cockpit door as though waiting for some kind of instruction. Nothing came. The plane drifted on, and all around me the passengers stayed still, silent. I don't know how long it went on, but there was a distinct sense that the cabin was holding its breath. No one spoke. I pressed the call button again. This time I wasn't sure if anyone was going to come. The flight had been uneventful. It was one of those long-haul flights where time seems to stretch, the hours blending together in the quiet monotony of engine noise, faint overhead announcements, and the occasional clink of a trolley moving down the aisle. I was somewhere in the middle of the cabin, sandwiched between a man with his headphones on and a woman buried in a novel. The seatbelt sign had been off for a while, and people were up and about, stretching their legs or heading to the lavatories. Then I noticed the cabin crew acting differently. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small things. One of them, a woman who'd been cheerfully handing out drinks earlier, walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Another followed shortly after, looking tense. The others carried on with their tasks, but there was a change in their movements, quicker, sharper. They weren't making eye contact with anyone. The flight attendant at the front of my section disappeared through the curtain leading to the cockpit area. She didn't come back. I shifted in my seat and checked the screen in front of me. The flight map was up, showing us cruising steadily across the Atlantic. The little plane icon crept along its dotted line toward our destination. Everything looked normal. I tried to convince myself that whatever was going on wasn't worth worrying about. Maybe there was some technical issue. Planes were full of systems and circuits. Things could go wrong without it being serious. Another flight attendant headed forward. This one glanced around before stepping through the curtain, her lips pressed into a tight line. I couldn't help but notice how her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers flexing nervously. Minutes passed. The cabin was quiet now, the murmurs of conversation and hum of activity tapering off. People were settling into that mid-flight lull, headphones on, heads drooping, a child or two crying faintly in the background. The lights flickered, just for a moment. It drew some attention, a couple of passengers looking up, a few glances exchanged, but they steadied again. It could have been turbulence or a slight power hiccup. Planes were resilient, I reminded myself. They had backup systems for everything. When another attendant walked briskly to the front and didn't return, I started to feel something I couldn't quite name, a nervous itch at the back of my mind, like an old instinct flaring to life. The overhead screen flickered again and the map disappeared, replaced by a blue grid. It wasn't unusual for in-flight entertainment to glitch, but it felt like another piece falling into some unknown puzzle. The engines droned on, steady, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. A passenger across the aisle from me unbuckled their seatbelt and stood. They craned their neck toward the front as if trying to see through the curtain. After a moment, they sat back down, shaking their heads slightly. Time dragged. The cabin crew didn't return. The curtains at the front of the plane remained still and the intercom stayed silent. I tapped the screen in front of me, but nothing responded. Then I noticed something on the horizon out of the window. It wasn't light or land, just a strange absence. The sort of absence that makes your brain hesitate, unsure of what it's looking at. I rubbed my eyes and stared harder, but the plane banked slightly, and the view shifted. Whatever it wasn't there anymore. Passengers were stirring now. People were speaking to each other in low voices, pointing toward the front of the cabin. I craned my neck and saw one of the attendants coming back down the aisle. Her face was pale, her steps hurried. She was heading toward the back of the plane, avoiding every single gaze. Then she was gone, slipping behind another curtain. The screens blinked again, cutting to black. I pressed the call button above my seat, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Nothing happened. The lights dimmed slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough that the world outside the windows became a featureless void. The aircraft gave a slight shudder, and there was a subtle change in the sound of the engines, not louder, not quieter, just different. I looked around to see if anyone else had noticed. People were whispering, shifting uneasily in their seats. The plane tilted again. This time it felt sharper, more purposeful. I checked the screen in front of me again, but it was still blank. My watch told me we should have been over Europe by now, but the view outside offered no clues. Just blackness stretching in every direction. Panic began to spread through the cabin. People were pressing buttons, standing in the aisles, calling out. The curtain at the front remained closed. There was no movement, no sound, no explanation. A woman a few rows ahead stood and moved toward the front of the plane. She reached the curtain and hesitated, glancing back once before pushing it aside. She stepped through. She didn't come back. Someone else followed, and another. Each time the curtain would sway slightly before falling still. No one returned. I stayed in my seat, gripping the armrests tightly. The engines continued their steady sound. The lights flickered again, and the air seemed thinner. The cabin grew quieter, fewer people, more empty seats. The aisle was empty now, the curtain undisturbed. The world outside the window remained impenetrable. When the lights cut out entirely, I didn't dare move. It was a quiet evening in the tower, the sort of shift you hope for but never expect. The night sky was clear, the air crisp, and the steady rhythm of inbound flights kept me just busy enough to stave off boredom. I leaned back in my chair, a steaming cup of tea beside me, and scanned the radar screen. Everything was as it should be, orderly, predictable, uneventful. Then Flight 919 pinged into view. The identifier popped up on my radar screen, a familiar code I hadn't seen in years. At first, I thought it was an equipment error, a glitch in the system. Planes don't just reappear after 5 years, but there it was, approaching on a vector that suggested it was coming in from the Atlantic. I keyed in a request for identification, expecting no response. The reply came almost immediately, a standard confirmation from the flight crew. Flight 919, en route from New York to London, requesting clearance for landing. The voice was calm, professional, like 100 others I'd heard during my years in the tower. I double-checked the records. There was no mistake. Flight 919 had vanished over the ocean 5 years ago, presumed lost with all 212 passengers and crew aboard. Wreckage had never been found, though theories had abounded. Engine failure, weather, even terrorism. The thought of speaking to a crew from a flight long declared lost sent a shiver through me. I granted clearance, my voice steadier than I felt, and watched as the radar showed the plane descending. The transponder data indicated everything was normal. Altitude, speed, heading. It was as though the aircraft had never been gone at all. The runway lights bathed the tarmac in a harsh white glow as the plane came into view. It looked ordinary enough, its sleek fuselage gleaming under the lights, its engines roaring as it touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop. The numbers on the tail matched the records perfectly. This was Flight 919. I tracked its taxi to the assigned gate. The ground crew approached cautiously, their vehicles keeping a respectful distance. The jet bridge was extended, locking into place with a soft thud. Normally, this was where passengers would begin disembarking, but the door remained shut. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The jet bridge operator tried knocking on the fuselage. There was no response. By now, the ground crew had alerted airport officials, and a team was assembled to board the plane. I watched from the tower, my breath fogging the window. The officials approached the aircraft in pairs, their movements deliberate and cautious. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting through the dim light as they stepped inside. I expected the radio to crackle with updates, but it stayed silent. The officials emerged 15 minutes later, their faces pale, their shoulders stiff, They conferred briefly before one of them made a call on a mobile phone. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the tension in his posture. Whatever they'd found or hadn't found had shaken them. The gate area was cordoned off and additional personnel arrived, including armed security and what looked like a forensics team. Word spread quickly among the staff that, though the details were sparse, no passengers, no crew. The cabin was empty, as though the plane had flown itself. I kept my eyes on the plane, half expecting someone to appear at one of the windows, waving frantically or signaling for help. But the windows remained dark, the aircraft a silent silhouette against the floodlit tarmac. An hour later, they towed the plane to a secure hangar. By then, the runway was bustling with activity. Unmarked vans arrived, along with men and women in suits who didn't look like they belonged to any airline. They moved with quiet efficiency, setting up floodlights and cordoning off a larger area around the hangar. I was asked to stay in the tower, told to monitor communications and log any anomalies. I wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the expression on the supervisor's face left no room for argument, so I stayed, staring at the empty gate and the blinking radar screen. Another ping, flight 919 again, but this time it was showing at cruising altitude, heading back out over the Atlantic. I called out to the supervisor, but by the time I turned back to the radar, the blip was gone. They locked the tower doors after that, citing protocol. I spent the rest of my shift alone, the silence in the room oppressive. Occasionally I glanced at the distant hangar, its doors tightly shut, and wondered what they were doing in there. When my relief arrived in the morning, I asked if they'd seen the plane. They looked at me blankly, as though I was speaking nonsense. There was no record of Flight 919 on the arrival logs, they said. No incident report. I clocked out, stepping into the pale dawn light. As I walked past the hangar, I noticed the vehicles were gone, the floodlights dismantled, the plane was nowhere to be seen. Back home, I checked the news, scouring every outlet I could find. Nothing. No mention of Flight 919. No reports of an unscheduled landing. It was as though the entire event had been scrubbed from existence. The landing was rough, but we were alive. That's what mattered. The pilot had said something over the intercom just before the engines cut out, a warning about turbulence or a mechanical fault, maybe both. It didn't make much difference. When the plane dropped, everything that wasn't strapped down went flying. Drinks, bags, people. The oxygen masks didn't deploy, but I clung to the seat in front of me like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. When the wheels hit the ground, the jolt threw my head forward, and the sound of metal screeching against tarmac was deafening. We skidded for what felt like ages before coming to a stop in the middle of nowhere. Through the tiny, scratched window, all I could see were trees. Thick, dark trees pressing in on all sides. No buildings, no lights, just forest. The cabin was eerily quiet for a moment, everyone stunned that we'd made it down in one piece. Then the panic set in, people fumbling with seatbelts, grabbing their bags, pushing towards the exits as though the plane might explode any second. I stayed put, gripping the armrests and trying to steady my breathing. Eventually I followed the crowd onto the tarmac. The air outside was cool and damp, smelling of wet leaves and engine oil. The plane looked worse than it had felt, a torn wing, smoke curling from one of the engines. But it was the setting that unsettled me most. The airfield, if you could even call it that, was overgrown and cracked with weeds sprouting through the tarmac. The buildings in the distance were skeletal, their roofs caved in and windows smashed. The crew did their best to maintain order. They rounded us up near the plane, handing out blankets and water bottles, though it was clear they didn't have much to go on. No phones worked. The pilot had mentioned something about the radio being damaged during the landing. We were stuck, and night was coming fast. The first scream came as we were settling into our makeshift camp near the wreck. Someone had wandered towards the tree line, probably to relieve themselves or look for a better signal. The noise cut through the murmurs of conversation, sharp and panicked. Everyone turned, but by the time we reached the spot, there was no one there, just the faint rustle of leaves and the distant snap of a branch. The crew tried to calm us, insisting the person would turn up, but they never did. The blankets and water bottles they'd left behind were still there, though, scattered on the ground as if dropped in a hurry. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, everyone was on edge. We huddled close together, the plane looming behind us like some wounded animal. The forest seemed to press in closer under the fading light, its branches forming jagged silhouettes against the sky. We built a fire using some emergency flares and what little dry wood we could scavenge from the airfield. It wasn't much, but it felt like the only thing keeping the dark at bay. People whispered among themselves, trying to explain the disappearance. Maybe the person had gotten lost. Maybe they'd fallen and hit their head. Theories that made sense when spoken aloud but didn't feel right in the pit of my stomach. Then another scream came, cutting through the night. This one was closer, from the direction of the plane. We scrambled to our feet, shining torches towards the noise, but the beams only revealed empty tarmac and jagged weeds. Someone pointed out that one of the crew members was missing, the man who'd been organizing the water bottles earlier. Panic began to spread. People clutched their bags, whispered prayers under their breath. A few of the braver ones tried to form a search party, but the crew dissuaded them, saying it was too dangerous in the dark. Instead, we clustered together, waiting for the night to end, listening for anything out of place. The hours dragged on, the fire burned low, and the forest seemed alive with movement just beyond the light's reach. Every so often someone would glance around and notice another person gone. There were no sounds of footsteps, no rustling of fabric, just the occasional scream, brief and chilling, followed by silence. By dawn, our numbers had halved. The crew had stopped trying to reassure us, their faces pale and drawn. The pilot, who'd been confident and calm when we first landed, now stood apart from the group, staring into the distance as though he could see something the rest of us couldn't. The air was thick with fear. No one wanted to move, but staying near the plane felt just as dangerous. When someone suggested heading into the forest to look for help, the idea was met with desperate agreement. Anything to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the airfield. We split into smaller groups, each heading in a different direction. I stuck with a handful of passengers, none of whom I knew. The trees closed in around us as we left the tarmac behind, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The forest floor was soft and uneven, covered in moss and fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps. For a while, nothing happened. We walked in silence, our breaths shallow, ears straining for any sign of movement. Then, one by one, people started disappearing. It was always the same. A faint sound, a rustle, a snap. And when we turned around, someone would be gone. Their belongings left behind, their torchlight extinguished. By midday, it was just me. I had no idea where I was or which direction the airfield lay. The forest seemed endless, the trees identical in every direction. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I kept walking, hoping to find a clearing, a road, anything that might lead me to safety. But the trees only grew thicker, their branches clawing at my clothes and face. The daylight was fading again, and with it, any hope of rescue. As night fell, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a pile of belongings, blankets, bags, torches, all arranged in a neat circle. They were ours. The passengers, the crew, everything we'd brought with us. But there was no one there. Only the forest and the darkness pressing in. And then I heard the scream. The turbulence was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It was the sort of shaking that threw you against your seatbelt and made the overhead bins snap open, spilling bags into the aisles. The cabin lights flickered and the air was filled with the panicked rustling of people clutching at armrests and seatbacks. I gripped the edges of my tray table until my knuckles ached, my teeth clenched tight. It went on for what felt like forever. The aircraft bounced and shuddered, metal groaning as if it might splinter apart. Something slammed into the roof above me with a hollow thud, probably a bag or a drinks cart, though I couldn't bring myself to look. Every few seconds I braced for the oxygen mask to drop. Then it stopped, not gradually like turbulence usually does, easing into smooth air. It was as if the whole plane had been clutched in a giant fist and then released. My head swam with relief, though my stomach churned from the violent movement. Around me the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. A child a few rows back whimpered softly, and someone coughed a wet, hacking sound. I glanced at my watch. We were well into the flight. Or we should have been. Based on the captain's earlier announcements, we were supposed to land in a couple of hours, but something was off. The cabin lights were dimmer than they should have been. The air felt different, stale, almost metallic. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the lingering sense of disorientation. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisles, checking on people and handing out tissues and ice packs for minor injuries. They looked tense but professional, their smiles brittle. One of them stopped at my row, asking silent questions with her eyes. I shook my head to indicate I was fine, but she didn't move on right away. Her gaze flicked to the window beside me, then back to my face. For a moment, I thought she was about to say something, but instead she turned sharply and continued down the aisle. I looked out the window. All I could see was darkness. No stars, no city lights below, just an expanse of black that stretched endlessly. Time passed in fits and starts. People murmured in low voices, their words unintelligible over the soft drone of the engines. The captain hadn't spoken since the turbulence. I assumed he was too busy dealing with whatever damage the plane might have sustained. But the silence gnawed at me. I checked my watch again. Another hour had passed, then another. Still no announcement. I leaned forward, craning my neck to peer down the aisle toward the galley, but there was no sign of the crew. The air had grown colder. I pulled the airline blanket over my lap, the fabric scratchy against my skin. The cabin lights flickered again, more insistently this time. A few passengers stirred, glancing around nervously. I tried to stay calm, reasoning with myself that turbulence like that could easily knock something loose in the wiring. But the flickering didn't stop. It became a steady, erratic pulsing, throwing shadows across the walls and ceiling. Someone in the row behind me gasped, and I turned instinctively. A man was pointing at the window, his face pale and slick with sweat. I followed his gaze. The blackness outside had changed. It was deeper, somehow, almost like looking into a void. My stomach twisted. I had flown enough times to know that even over the ocean there were usually at least faint traces of moonlight or the faint glow of far-off cities. This was different. The engines hummed on, steady and unchanged, but the flight attendants were gone now, and no one seemed to know where they'd gone. One by one, passengers were unbuckling their seatbelts, standing in the aisles and looking around with wide eyes. Someone tried the lavatory, but the door wouldn't budge. Another passenger pushed their way toward the front of the plane, where the curtain to the cockpit hung slightly askew. They didn't come back. I stared at the little screen embedded in the seatback in front of me, hoping to find the flight map. It was blank. A blue grid hovered there, flickering faintly. I pressed the buttons, but nothing happened. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom suddenly, a garbled sound that made the hairs on my arm stand on end. It was impossible to make out what he was saying. Static filled the cabin, louder and louder, until I clamped my hands over my ears. Just as suddenly, it stopped. I couldn't say how much time passed after that, maybe hours, maybe minutes. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, so total it felt almost tangible. The air in the cabin had grown colder still, my breath misting faintly as I exhaled. A child whimpered somewhere nearby, the sound cutting off abruptly as though smothered. The aisle lights flickered, then dimmed entirely. For the first time I noticed that the drone of the engines had changed, subtle but undeniable. A lower pitch, almost as if they were struggling, or maybe they were further away. I clutched the armrests of my seat, my eyes locked on the emergency exit over the wing. A faint, silvery sheen seemed to ripple across the window there. Though it could have been a trick of the light, my heartbeat thundered in my ears. When the cabin lights cut out completely, I didn't scream. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The storm was bad enough to ground all flights for the night, which was how I found myself stuck in an airport that felt more like an abandoned shopping center than a transportation hub. The terminal wasn't large, just a few gates, a small cafe, and some dimly lit corridors leading off to God knows where. The announcement about the cancellations had been garbled and barely audible over the crackling speakers, but the gist of it was clear enough. No planes were leaving. Not tonight. A handful of other passengers milled around, their faces a mix of frustration and fatigue. Some slumped in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, their heads bent over phones or books. A young woman leaned against a pillar, chewing her nails as she stared out the rain-streaked windows. An older man in a suit had fallen asleep in one of the chairs, his briefcase wedged awkwardly under his legs like it might sprout wings and fly off without him. The storm outside was relentless. Rain lashed against the high windows and the wind howled through the cracks in the old building. The lights flickered occasionally, not enough to panic anyone, but enough to remind us all just how far removed this place was from anything resembling civilization. The skeleton crew of airport staff, if you could even call them that, didn't inspire much confidence. A man in a maintenance uniform shuffled through the terminal once, his expression blank and distant. Two women wearing security badges sat behind the counter at the cafe, though they seemed more interested in whispering to each other than serving anyone. I wandered over to the cafe at one point, hoping to grab a sandwich or a drink. The shelves were almost bare, just a few limp sandwiches in plastic containers and some bags of crisps. I picked up a water bottle and made my way to the counter, but neither of the women acknowledged me. They didn't even look up. After a few awkward moments, I left a coin on the counter and walked away. It didn't feel right to disturb them. The hours dragged on. The terminal felt colder than it should have. The kind of cold that seeped into your skin and made you wish you'd packed an extra jumper. I found an empty row of chairs and tried to get comfortable, but the constant flickering of the overhead lights made it impossible to rest. Somewhere behind me, a vending machine buzzed loudly, its fluorescent display flickering on and off in sync with the terminal lights. It wasn't until later, hours maybe, that I realized something was strange. I'd been trying to distract myself by watching the storm, counting the flashes of lightning through the glass, when I noticed how quiet it had become. Not just quiet, but silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, as if they're trying to fill the void. I turned around, expecting to see the same handful of passengers scattered across the terminal, but there were fewer of them. It wasn't obvious at first. The young woman by the pillar was gone, and the man with the briefcase wasn't asleep in his chair anymore. I figured they'd moved somewhere else, to the toilets maybe, or to find a quieter corner to wait out the night, but as I looked around, I realized there were more empty seats than there had been before. The couple who had been arguing near the gate, gone. The family with the two noisy kids, nowhere to be seen. I stood up, the plastic chair creaking loudly beneath me, and scanned the terminal. There were still people, but fewer than there should have been. The cafe was dark now, its counter empty. The two women had disappeared as well, leaving the register unmanned and the lights off. I wandered over to the gate where the arguing couple had been. Their suitcases were still there, abandoned in the aisle. One of them had tipped over, spilling clothes onto the floor. A child's toy sat on top of the pile, its bright colors dulled by the flickering light. I bent down to pick it up, but stopped halfway. It felt wrong to touch it. The maintenance worker shuffled past again, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor. I called out, but he didn't turn. He kept walking, disappearing down one of the unlit corridors without a glance in my direction. The wind outside howled louder than ever, rattling the glass and drowning out any noise in the terminal. I walked back towards the seating area, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. People had left for another part of the airport, that was all. Maybe the ground crew had directed them somewhere, or they'd found a place to sleep that wasn't freezing and uncomfortable. But as I passed the rows of seats, I saw more abandoned bags, a rucksack slumped against a chair, a plastic carrier bag with half-eaten snacks still inside. I hadn't noticed these before. The lights flickered again, this time longer, plunging the terminal into darkness for a full 2 seconds before coming back on. When they did, there were fewer people than before. I wasn't alone yet. There was still the older woman with the knitting bag, though her needles were idle in her lap now, and her head was tilted at an odd angle. A man in a leather jacket sat near the far wall, staring down at his phone. But that was it. The rest of the seats were empty. The vending machine's buzzing grew louder. The storm raged outside, but the terminal felt quieter than ever. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Couldn't hear the rain. And then the lights went out again. We were circling, and I was trying to stay calm. The seatbelt sign had been on for hours, and every few minutes the plane banked slightly to the left or right, giving me alternating views of clouds and the sprawling city far below. The cabin crew moved up and down the aisle earlier, doing their best to maintain a veneer of normality. Water bottles, pretzels, calm smiles. Now they were strapped in at their jump seats, silent and still. The captain had made an announcement when we first entered the holding pattern, something about congestion over the airport. Since then, nothing. The murmurs had died down as time dragged on. A sense of shared fatigue had settled over the passengers, though it wasn't the sort that lets you relax. It was the kind that gnaws at the edges of your nerves, leaving you too drained to speak but too tense to close your eyes. Every so often, someone shifted in their seat or glanced out of the window as if expecting something to change, but nothing did. I stared at the screen on the seat back in front of me, the flight tracker looping endlessly. Our little plane icon circled and circled, its trail forming a perfect oval above the city. It didn't make sense. Whatever had caused the delay should have cleared by now. There was only so much air traffic in the world, wasn't there? And yet we circled. The city below was vast, glittering in the late afternoon light, but its details were hazy. Skyscrapers poked through the mist like jagged teeth, and the roads crisscrossed in tangled patterns, vehicles moving like ants. I squinted, trying to spot a landmark or a familiar feature, but the higher we flew, the less real it all looked, as though the city were a painting instead of a place. The turbulence began as a faint shudder underfoot. Nothing unusual at first, just the plane's steady climb and descent through invisible currents. But it worsened, rattling the tray table in front of me. A few passengers gasped, clutching their armrests or looking around nervously. The seatbelt sign blinked again, though it hadn't been turned off. The plane leveled out briefly, only to bank again, starting yet another circle. The announcement never came. The man across the aisle glanced my way, his face pale and his knuckles tight on the edge of his seat. I didn't know what he wanted me to do. I wasn't a pilot. I wasn't even in an exit row. What could I possibly say to make this better? I looked away, fixing my gaze on the tiny air vent above my head. It wasn't blowing anymore. Hours passed. It was hard to tell how many. The sunlight outside dimmed, turning the clouds a deep orange before fading to grey. The city lights below twinkled like a vast glowing map. Still we circled. The captain's voice broke through the silence. There was no reassurance this time, no placating tone. He spoke quickly, his words clipped and mechanical, mentioning a technical issue and urging passengers to remain seated. There was a pause, a long one, before he added that everything was under control. He didn't sound convinced. One of the cabin crew unbuckled herself and hurried toward the cockpit. Her face was unreadable, her posture rigid. The remaining crew looked straight ahead, their hands folded in their laps. I thought I saw one of them close her eyes for a moment, her lips moving silently, but I might have imagined it. The lights flickered, just for a second, enough to make my heart jump and my hands grip the armrest tighter. It was nothing, probably. Planes were built to handle far worse than a flicker, weren't they? The turbulence came back stronger. It felt like being in a car on a bumpy road, except there was no road, just endless sky. Someone, a few rows ahead, retched into a sick bag, the sound barely audible over the groan of the engines. The man across the aisle pulled the seatbelt tighter around his waist, his lips pressed together so tightly they'd gone white. The lights flickered again, this time staying off for a heartbeat longer. The hum of the engines faltered before returning, but it was different now, quieter, like they were laboring. A few passengers started pressing the call buttons. The chime echoed faintly through the cabin, but no one came. The cabin crew remained in their seats, staring straight ahead, their faces masks of blank professionalism. The plane banked again, but this time the angle was sharper. My stomach dropped and several people cried out. The flight tracker on the screen in front of me showed the same oval, but the edges were jagged now, the path wobbling. We weren't just circling anymore, we were drifting. Through the tiny window I saw the city below blur as the plane turned sharply. Something looked off. The lights were still there, but they were dimmer, their patterns uneven. Streets that should have been lined with bright lines of cars were dark and empty. The skyscrapers seemed fewer, shorter, their silhouettes fading into the darkness. The engines sputtered again. This time they didn't recover immediately. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, and then cut out completely. A few people switched on their phones, their screens glowing like fireflies in the dark. The light wasn't enough to show much, just the outlines of faces, pale and wide-eyed, and the faint gleam of safety cards sticking out of seat pockets. The nose of the plane tipped forward slightly, enough to make my stomach churn. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom again, but it was barely audible over the groan of the engines and the rush of air outside. I caught the words fuel and divert, but the rest was lost in static. The city lights below winked out all at once. One moment they were there and the next, nothing. just blackness, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky seemed to swallow us whole. Someone screamed. It was short and sharp, and then the cabin was silent except for the faint hiss of air and the groaning engines. The plane dipped lower, the cabin tilting forward as though the air itself had vanished, and we were falling into something else. The turbulence was barely worth noting. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and a nervous chuckle rippled through the cabin as passengers adjusted their straps. I was a few hours into a red-eye flight, my tray table down, and an airline meal half forgotten in front of me. The roar of the engines was steady, a kind of background music that made you forget you were 35,000 feet above the ocean. Then came the lurch. It wasn't a bounce like the ones you feel on bumpy flights. It was a drop, sudden and startling, like the ground had fallen away beneath the plane. My stomach flipped, and a drink cart rattled sharply in the aisle. A baby cried somewhere up ahead. The cabin lights flickered, briefly plunging us into darkness. When they returned, the hum of conversation that had broken out among passengers quieted, replaced by a murmur of nervous shuffling and seatbelts clicking tighter. The flight attendants, always the first to show unease if something was amiss, had paused mid-stride, their eyes darting towards the cockpit door. I glanced out the window. The view was obscured, nothing but blackness pressing against the small oval pane. A storm, perhaps. I couldn't see lightning, but the plane jolted again, harder this time, and overhead compartments rattled. I gripped the armrests and tried to steady my breathing. Around me, passengers exchanged nervous glances. A businessman clutched his briefcase like it was a life preserver, while a teenager across the aisle pulled headphones from his ears, frowning at the ceiling. The intercom crackled, but no voice came. Static filled the air for a moment before cutting off entirely. That's when the lights went out. In the pitch black, I could feel the air in the cabin change. It wasn't a physical thing, more like a collective intake of breath, a tension that radiated from every seat. My heart was thudding so loudly in my chest I could hear it over the growing sound of the engines straining. I waited for an announcement, a calming word from the cockpit, anything to explain what was happening. Nothing came. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, bathing the cabin in a dim, sickly glow, I saw the flight attendants huddled near the galley. They weren't speaking, just staring at each other as if trying to decide who should go to the cockpit. One of them finally broke away and moved forward, their steps hesitant, one hand gripping the backs of seats as the plane jolted again. The turbulence grew worse, throwing the plane side to side like a toy caught in a child's tantrum. People began to panic now, gasping and clutching at their armrests. I pressed my forehead against the window, desperate for some sense of orientation, but it was just black, no stars, no moonlight, just an empty void. Then the engines faltered. For a heart-stopping moment, the sound dipped. The vibrations in the floor lessened, as if the plane were losing its grip on the air. It came back, sputtering unevenly, and the lights flickered once more. I wasn't sure whether I should be relieved or more frightened. The hum was there, but it wasn't steady, wasn't right. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Every time the turbulence eased, it returned with renewed ferocity. I focused on the tray table, on the pattern of plastic scuffs, trying not to let my mind spiral. But then came the movement in the corner of my eye. I turned towards the aisle. The co-pilot had emerged from the cockpit. His uniform was disheveled, the crisp white shirt clinging to him like he'd been sweating. His eyes were wide, darting around the cabin as if looking for something or someone. He walked past without acknowledging anyone, muttering under his breath. As he passed me, I caught a glimpse of his face. It wasn't right. His expression wasn't one of fear, but something far more unsettling, a mix of confusion and dread that didn't belong to a man trained to handle emergencies. He disappeared into the galley, and I saw him speaking to one of the attendants, gesturing back towards the cockpit. She didn't move, she just stared at him, pale as the overhead lights, and then the engines cut out entirely. The silence was deafening. No hum, no vibration, just the creaking of the fuselage and the distant howl of the wind outside. In the absence of the engines, every sound was amplified. I could hear the shallow breathing of the woman next to me, the click of someone's teeth chattering several rows back. When the power returned, it wasn't all at once. The lights stuttered on and off, dimming more each time. The co-pilot reappeared in the aisle. His walk was slower now, his movements erratic. He stopped mid-stride, turning his head slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. I didn't dare move. No one did. We all just sat there, frozen as the plane shuddered violently again. Overhead compartments burst open, luggage spilling into the aisle. A woman screamed, and that seemed to break whatever spell we'd been under. Chaos erupted, people shouting, scrambling to secure their things. The intercom crackled again. This time there was a sound, a low, garbled noise that wasn't a voice but felt like it should have been. It filled the cabin for several seconds before cutting off. The co-pilot had vanished. The plane dipped sharply, throwing me against the armrest. I clung to it as the cabin tilted, and for a horrifying moment, I thought we were going to roll. Then it righted itself, but the turbulence was relentless now, hammering us from every direction. I don't know how long it went on. Time lost all meaning in that cabin, trapped in the half-light and the chaos. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen the co-pilot again. The flight attendants were nowhere to be found either. It was just us, hundreds of passengers, alone in the dark, clinging to our seats as the storm raged around us. Then the lights went out again. For good.